don't think churches should be exempt from taxation, because that constitutes a subsidy. So tax-exempt churches shouldn't be allowed. Second, I think if someone's found mutilating the genitals of their children, they should go straight to jail and shouldn't be allowed to plead a religious right to do so. Same with honor killing, same with polygamy, same with bride price, same with child marriage, and I think if a Jehovah's Witness or a Christian Scientist lets a child die from neglecting to take them to the doctor, the same should apply. That should be the last thing they do on the outside. So obviously the common law has to be made to apply. And I think that Congress should hear, and the Supreme Court should hear, evidence that no American aid money should be allowed to go to Israel that is even diverted to the building of Messianic settlements on the West Bank, because as well as theft, that's the establishment of religion using American taxpayers' money and should be illegal. And if there's going to be equal time for the teaching of religion in schools, then every church that takes a faith-based initiative subsidy or a tax break should be forced to spend half of its time teaching the origin of species. I think that's only fair. When I said in my subtitle, this is a lousy microphone, isn't it? Or is it only for me? When I said in my subtitle that there's something about religion that poisons everything, I know publishers like controversial subtitles, but I was willing to stand by it, and I knew people would say everything. I mean, cricket, tantric sex, Chinese food. Yes, I sort of do mean, in a way, everything. For this reason, it attacks us in our deepest integrity, in some of the ways I've just tried to describe. It says we don't ourselves have any innate knowledge of what's good or wicked. We couldn't, on our own responsibility, out of our own self-respect, decide upon an action in this way and decide to defend its integrity. We would need divine permission and maybe even a human sacrifice or two to ram it home. For this to occur, and I go on to say that it makes intelligent people say stupid things, and it makes decent and kindly people do and say very cruel things. The King James Version famously says, "Thou shalt not kill," though the original Hebrew makes it very obvious that the meaning is, "Thou shalt do no murder." These transliterations, by the way, can be very hazardous and very useful. The Hebrew word alma, for example, means young woman. That's all it means. When mistranslated by King James's committee as virgin, it very much alters the idea that a young woman will one day conceive and bring forth a son. And a great deal of misunderstanding has resulted from that error in translation. I'm reminded of the lady governor of Texas, who, during a controversy about bilingualism in the State House in Austin, said if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it was plenty good enough for her. We so far haven't found any society in which the penal code, we've looked, anthropologists have searched, we've found no society in which the penal code approves of or is neutral about murder or theft or perjury. Adultery is treated differently in different cultures, but the murder, theft, and perjury are not. One might argue that the Jewish people wouldn't have made it as far as they did to Mount Sinai, assuming always that they did make the trip, if they had been under the impression that murder, theft, perjury, and adultery were okay until they got there.
Most of the historical figures in the ancient world are attested to by one or two, or in Christ has probably more attestations than many other figures whose historicity you wouldn't doubt for a moment.
Dinesh, I don't know why you're doing this to yourself.
I'm doing it to you, actually.
The existence of the Macedonian royal house is an archaeological question as well as among many others. It's decidable in innumerable ways. The probability of there having been someone with the one name of Socrates is very high, but it can't be absolutely attested to, and it doesn't need to be, because those ideas would have been in someone else's mouth if they weren't in his. The idea, it surely is important to you that the physical existence of Jesus can be proved in a rather different way, since he is the Son of God, and the Word made flesh, and born of a virgin, and by his death we are all healed. So you've got a little bit more riding on this than I do, and you've got no evidence for it. None. But you note that in the 10th commandment, unlike the others, There's no specific action that's being either condemned or recommended, neither enjoined nor exhorted or forbidden or prohibited. Instead, we've got the first recorded instance that I know of thought crime. It's not you're not supposed to do it, it's you're not even supposed to think about it. This is why those of us who maintain a critique of religion make the charge that it is implicitly totalitarian. It can convict you for things that are only in your head, for thoughts that have hardly begun to form. And there's another reason, I think, why this commandment is somewhat sinister. It appears to forbid the poor from resenting the rich, if you want to make a left critique of it, or if you want to approach matters from a free market point of view, it seems to crush the spirit of emulation and competition that's involved in wishing you had a better life. Some Jewish authors have argued that the prohibition only extends to actual neighbors, in the sense of those who dwell in the immediate vicinity, and some have said it only applies to covetousness of that sort, but it would surely be a fairly paltry commandment that excused this exact same attitude if it was directed at people further away. And only then do you notice, when that thought has occurred to you, in the mind that you have that's always alive with subversive thinking, you suddenly notice that the children of Israel are precisely and all the time being ordered to covet, being enjoined to covet, being told they must envy and hope to annex the lands, the flocks, the herds, and the women of neighboring tribes. They're kept going by greed, by the thought soon all these people's property will be yours, and that you'll be licensed to take it by force, and kill them and have the land and not the people. This is perhaps why, this ambition is perhaps why there are no prohibitions against, say, slavery, or rape, or genocide, or child abuse in the Ten Commandments. It's not a matter of leaving these out, or applying situational ethics to a time that was not ours. It's not that, I don't think so. Such things have always been known of and usually deplored. It's more, I fear, that such terrible things as rape, enslavement, genocide and child abuse are just about to be mandatory. They're just about to be forced on people as things that they are not just must not do, but must do if the conquest is to continue. In other words, I think that our morality is innate, our ethics are innate to us, as they are in other mammalian and primate species. It's observable that there are solidarities, there are ways of group behavior, family function and so forth that make it clear that without this kind of evolution we wouldn't be having this discussion. We wouldn't be here if we only looked out for each other, and other primates and mammals know this too. In that case, since the evils are innate in us as well, what are we to do? Are we to invent another supernatural person who's responsible for those, as the religious tend to do? Those don't come from this God, they come from another God, an evil one. Well, fine, if you wish, if you want to do it, if it makes you feel better in some way, invent another supernatural entity. There's an infinite multiplication of them that you can do, as Aquinas did with the demons, as Muhammad did with the desert jinns. Keep multiplying these assumptions. But how long can a healthy mind be satisfied with the infinite replication of supernatural assumptions when the natural world explains itself, and when we already have enough explanation for why people are encoded and programmed the way they are, and where our knowledge of that is increasing all the time? What is, and I'll close on this and I'll be quick, what we risk if we take the supernatural route is the idea of an unchangeable, unalterable authority, one apparently benign, one apparently wicked, both of them eternal, both of them unchanging and unchangeable, and ourselves as their playthings and their objects and their raw material. This is the origin of the idea of the totalitarian. This is where the idea of tyranny begins, with the eternal, unchanging, tyrannical authority, where we must try with our poor powers to guess what's wanted of us and to spend our lives on our knees. I say the beginning of emancipation is to repudiate this antique serfdom and all the contemptible and often laughable superstitions that it requires for its maintenance. And the job can be begun tonight, and I invite you to join me in doing so. Thank you. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. So you might think that someone who keeps the commandments won't have their children persecuted unto the next generation, so that if the next generation of children didn't keep the commandments, they'd still be protected by the fact that their parents had kept the commandments. But no. Thou shalt not take the name of thy Lord, the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Right. You see where I'm going with that. All of this suggesting a great insecurity and unease. Then comes the requirement, again tediously repeated, for the observance of the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son. I may as well finish this. Nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Uncontroversial in itself, a day off, but again, having nothing to do in this case with ethics or morality, but only with the fear of the Lord. It is only obedience to that fear that is moral. And it's interesting as marking, not for the first time or the last, those to whom it applies. Male bosses and employers are the ones addressed, and their manservants and maidservants, nor their cattle are permitted to work on Sunday or the Shabbat. A confusion between people and chattel, that is going to recur again very soon. Indeed, if anything can show you that there's a good argument that the commandments are man-made and not God-ordained, it would be the general Exodus emphasis on agriculture and sheep and lamb and goat products in general. I had a debate on the BBC recently with Canon Slee, one of the deputies of the Archbishop of Canterbury, in which I said that one of the things I disliked about Christianity when I was quite small was having to think of myself as a member of a flock. In other words, as a sheep or lamb. And also having to reflect that shepherds don't look after sheep just because they like them, though some shepherds like them much too much. But in order that they can first fleece them and then kill them. And Slee, to his credit, he took me up on it rather decently. He said, you know, it was a problem for us with the church in New Guinea, where I served for a considerable time, because as with a huge number of areas of the world, there are no sheep in New Guinea. Exodus is limited in that way too. Even the animals it describes aren't available everywhere. So he said, we had to work out what the locals in New Guinea valued as the Israelites would have valued sheep. He said, it got to the point where one Easter I saw my bishop get up into the pulpit and address his congregation and say in English to them, O Lord, behold these your swine. So you see how off the track you can get, off the beaten track you get with agricultural metaphors and how confining they can be. And of course it would have to be a pig, the very one that Yahweh most eloquently condemns elsewhere. As I say, if this is God-made, it looks somewhat man-made all the same. Now, furthermore, if one day, and only one day, is holy, it can suggest that others are profane. And that's led to a good deal of fetishism of the Sabbath and of Shabbat. I remember when I used to work in Northern Ireland, trying to point out to the Reverend Ian Paisley, I worked for a Sunday show at the time. He wouldn't be interviewed by anyone whose show or newspaper came out on Sunday. So I tried to point out to him, Reverend, it's the Monday papers that are printed on the Sunday. And I could see his piggy eyes sort of narrowing as he took this in. It took him a long, long time before he'd give an interview to the Observer. But in the end, reason prevailed.
I have to take back some of the nice things I was just saying about the one of them has to do with the prearrangement. I've heard him make that point about the bull's horns so many times now. Tonight was the lamest. I've also heard him try it on other people. I hope this is the last time I have to hear it. I noticed it didn't go down that well. It's because it's not that good. He was also never at that rodeo. To his second point, which I can scarcely believe I have heard made, let alone, and some of you should blush on your way home, let alone applauded. Yes, of course, the reason why civilization stopped being barbaric and why stuff started to happen was the arrival of monotheism. I mean to say, there is a one-word refutation of that, I think. Do you want to know what it is?
You've guessed. This is a university, China. When the first missionaries reached the emperor at Beijing, as he sat amid a civilization that dwarfed anything that Europe and the Middle East or Latin America, even at its height, had ever produced, he said, if what you are telling me is true, how has it taken so long to reach the people of China? No, I'm sorry, there are some arguments that just won't do and don't require any further refutation. The lost years, the lost millennia of the misery of human prehistory have to be taken into account. And after all, we were invited to touch upon them by Dinesh in considering the difference between antique and modern slavery. All right, I'm not going to reject a challenge like that. And slavery in antiquity was this: you lose, our civilization has conquered yours. You now work, you the victims, you work for us. You're machines from now on. You work under our lash. You build our system for us. You build our walls. You dig our canals in return for our rations. Woe to the conquered. You can easily see how it happened. It is only with the arrival of religion that it is said in holy books that certain people are born as a race or people to be the masters, and others to be dispensable, either to be slaughtered, or when most of the slaughter is done, for the remainder to be kept, often female, as slaves. In every holy book, from the original holy books of the Jewish people through those wrongly adopted, in my view, mistakenly adopted by the Christian religion, to the Quran, to the Book of Mormon, slavery is mandated, and those who are born into it, usually by a different colored skin, are clearly, plainly identified, usually as the sons of Ham, or some such nonsense, pseudo-ethnological garbage. Okay? That's what's different. So, in the waning centuries of this foul system, it is true that some Christians, out of conscience, turned against it. Wilberforce is one of the best known. William Lloyd Garrison, who later became a secular humanist, is another very famous case. But it was never not the case, and this is what Abraham Lincoln pointed out with such irony and bitterness. It was never not the case that all the justifications for slavery were religious too, and that all the leaders of it, and all the profiteers of it, were taking their text and their authority from the Holy Scriptures. That's what you can't get over. And that's what you can't accuse the Babylonians and the Sumerians of doing. So my point remains exactly what it was. Not that religion doesn't make people behave better, because it quite plainly does not. But that there are things in it that no secularist would regard with other than the horror that we now reserve for things like cannibalism and slavery. The genital mutilation community, ladies and gentlemen, is exclusively, as far as I know, a religious one. The mutilation of the genitals of children, forcible mutilation of genitals, is entirely scripturally mandated. The suicide bombing community among some Tamils in Sri Lanka may or may not be partly secular. It depends. Some of them are very extreme Buddhists, and some of them quite extreme Hindus. But for the most part, the hideous idea of suicide murder is a religious mandate, not just something that has religious authority, but is a commandment. People wouldn't do this if they didn't have faith. I'll open our next session with a question. I'll make it my closing, because I think it's time for my closing. And I'll ask it not just to Dinesh, but I'm hoping to leave all my questions in the minds of all present for this evening. There's a baby born tonight in Pakistan. Would you rather, from the point of view of ethics, morality, the advance of human civilization, that this baby adopt my views of secular humanism, or that it become a Wahhabi Muslim baby? Because if you think that religion is good for people, I don't see why you don't say the second. And if you don't say the second, I think you ought to work out why you don't say the second. And if you prefer it over me, see me afterwards. Okay? Thank you.
One is compelled here to re-examine the authorship of Deuteronomy, which tells us that Moses by then had reached the age of 120, adding that his eye was not dimmed nor his natural force abated. One begins to doubt it because it seems that, like many elderly men, he'd begun to repeat his favourite stories to captive audiences who were naturally a touch shy about interrupting him and not always remembering the stories precisely the same way. A bit the same with some of the incantations. So, I don't want to trespass on the time that we shall have to discuss these great questions together, but I'll just try and pull my threads to a conclusion by returning to the questions I asked at the beginning. Did God make man, or did man make God? And does morality come from on high, or not? To the first question, the study of the so-called Ten Commandments allows us to return a pretty confident reply. The whole story is one of muddle, chaos, inconsistency, revision as one goes along, temper tantrums, lapses into rage, insanity, sadism, vengeance, and general losing of the thread. This would argue either for a very muddled, irrational, forgetful, inconsistent God, or for no God at all. But if we make the assumption that this mass of unresolved contradictions was the outcome of the ignorant struggles of a semi-literate, frightened species of primates, then the mystery clears up all by itself.
Excuse me, the willingness of people to die for a rumor or a delusion or an illusion is very well attested. There's no element. There's never been, alas for our poorly evolved mammalian primate species, there's never been a period of history, however modern, where that won't happen. Look at how many people are still willing to do this for Joseph Smith, for example. Or for a deluded epileptic called Muhammad, a plagiarist of some of the foregoing. I repeat, if you will accept this for one, will you not accept it for all? Or are you not obliged to accept it for all? Are not all these prophets and revelations equally valid or equally false? My position is at least unintelligible. It is true that the Declaration speaks of inalienable rights from a creator. But in my opinion, this is a negation of what had been, up till then, the only way right was ever mentioned, which was that there was a divine right of kingship. If you recall, that's what was being overthrown. Had already been overthrown in part in Britain, was being overthrown in the United States. The claim of the king to have his authority from the Creator was false. Now, if that claim is false, and I believe that it is, there is no divine right of kings, you can do one of two things. You can either say, well, if there are rights, then everyone should have them and claim them from the Creator, which is a sort of tautology. Or you can say that rights don't come from a Creator, that they are innate in us and in our species, and we'll get the ones we fight for and defend. We won't get the ones we don't. And most of the time, we're defending these rights against theocracy.
I don't think I'll propose a New Testament-style update of the sort that orders us to love one another because, call me old-fashioned if you will, the idea of mandatory, compulsory love has always struck me as a rather sickly one, or even a sinister one, especially when it originates as an injunction from a Godhead of which, or of whom, you're also supposed to be afraid. To be ordered to love someone of whom you have to be in dread is a form of sadomasochism. It's the essence of Orwell's Big Brother cult. It's not enough to obey, you have to love the obeisance as well. It's the seedbed of the totalitarian. Love cannot be exacted. But one might argue in searching for a new code that at the very least we might enact some stern prohibitions. It's not just our modern sensibilities, I think, or our consciousness of the fragility of our survival as a species that might incline us now, if we were drawing up a code, to forbid slavery, to condemn genocide, the rape and torture of children, and the despoliation of the natural order of the world. I hope that these might be considered, in Benjamin Franklin's great words contributed to Thomas Jefferson's great preamble, self-evident. Unfortunately, though, we can't do this by amending this book, because slavery, genocide, and the rape and torture of children are not merely not denounced in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, they are rather very enthusiastically recommended. So if we search for ways of doing the right thing, we're consulting the wrong book, and we're looking for morality in all the wrong places. Perhaps, though, there is still something to be salvaged, and if so, it might be found in the long, vainglorious, menacing throat clearings of the very first commandment. We might give some real thought to the prohibition on the making of idols and of images. We might do well to stop forging manacles with our own minds and setting up impressions and images of ourselves as if they were divine and reified and supernatural. We might cease to make whips for our own backs. We might stop making tyrants and despots in our own image. We have rights as well as duties in respect of one another, and as one can intuit from Thomas Paine, in order to safeguard and enjoy the rights of man, we shall require a new age of reason. Thank you.
Well, but that's precisely the error I was just identifying. If you can suck one right out of your thumb and call it divine, why can't you say, well then, oysters have the same right, that it comes from their creator? There is no, as you yourself have pointed out, with the rights industry, no real limit to this, especially if you attribute it to the divine. Generally speaking, though, the struggle for rights is a struggle for humans to assert themselves against other humans who want to oppress them in the name of God.
Do you mean, sir, that we do not have
Well,
it's me again, the questioner.
Yes, sir.
Do you mean then...
You suddenly seemed a little, what shall I say?
Omniscient?
It just came from somewhere else. Gave me a nasty turn. Yes, please, go ahead.
Do you mean then that we do not have any innate rights towards each other than what we assert by force? Did I hear you right? Or did I hear you wrong?
I tend to agree with those who've said that the concept of right, of recht, is a human creation, that it's an arbitrary creation, yes. And that we'd be better to say that we get the ones we fight for, that we don't get the ones we don't, and that our duties are, and solidarities with each other are mandated by evolution and are not in any sense predicated on anything supernatural. My view of the mammalian evolution of our species is that we are programmed to be superstitious. Religion is unvanquishable, unbanishable, as long as we're partly rational, as long as our prefrontal lobes are too small, our adrenaline glands are too large, and our opposing thumbs are still too clumsy. Of course, people can be sold every kind of delusion. I half agree with G.K. Chesterton when he said that people don't believe in God. They don't believe in nothing but in anything. I believe that the belief in God is a willingness to believe in anything. But if you take Orthodox religion away, you may very well find someone worshipping a pet rock, or a tame fish, or a crystal, or some New Age nonsense healing process. Yeah, but that's the way a lot of people are. I just would like to say that there's a solid minority of us who are not impressed by any of this. And we're citizens too. And deserve that much respect.
The Pew Research Center in the United States has recently done a lot of work on religious allegiance, and what it's found is that the largest growing minority in your southern neighbor is those who check none of the above in the box marked faith. It's double what it was 10 years ago. I would predict it would double again in the next 10 years. It's about 13 to 14% now. These are not atheists, I should say, but they are people who, if you wanted to say what their common and unifying proposition was, would be this: an ethical life can be lived without reference to the supernatural. Simple proposition. And that plus, I think, the desire to defend the Constitution and the idea of a secular republic and the separation of church and state from theocratic bullying, both at home and abroad. People have had enough of being menaced and threatened and lectured and terrified by those who claim to have God on their side, whether it's obviously the forces of jihad or more insidiously and nearer home, those who want to have stultifying nonsense taught to American school children with taxpayers' money, let alone the idea that equal time should go to stultifying nonsense. In other words, after the biology class, we have the intelligent design moment. Don't call it intelligent design, by the way. You've made a concession if you agree to call it that. Call it creationism, is what it is. So then we have the astronomy period, and then we'll do Mrs. Jenkins will take you for astrology after the break. And then tomorrow we'll have your alchemy papers all ready. It's enough to make a cat laugh, and people won't have it.
Nobody wants to come from a state that gets laughed at for that kind of stupidity. And no one's going to hold their convention in the capital city of a state that does it. And it's been defeated now in every court and school board in the land. And I'm proud to say, I think, after battling it for a long time, I've lived to see these people defeated. Not just defeated, but also humiliated, which is very nice.
I would prefer to say that science bases itself on evidence as well as reason, and that's the missing term in Christianity and Islam and Judaism and the rest of it. A good scientist will say, here's what I'll tell you now in advance would prove me wrong. Here's what I think is the case. But if you find this, I'll tell you now, I'll climb down. So for evolution, there is no religious believer who can do you that service, who can say to you, show me this and I'll stop believing. It's never been done. In the nature of the thing, it couldn't be done. The E word for religious people is essentially meaningless. It's occasionally convenient. Sometimes they think they'd like some evidence, usually in the form of miracles, because faith always turns out to be not quite enough. Let's have a bit of evidence, a tiny bit. It depends what authority they think they're obeying. I mean, if the Pope says you must go on crusade, and this is a war for God, and you will be rewarded in paradise if you undertake it. If you believe what the Pope says, I think it's not inconsistent with being a Christian, as I understand it. You are, to me, responsible for all the crimes you thereupon commit. I'm not going to claim more for atheism than it will bear. I mean, you can be an atheist, and you can be a psychopath. You can be an atheist and be a sadist. You can be an atheist and be a fascist. It's actually quite uncommon, the latter. Most fascists actually were Catholics, but you can be an atheist and be a Stalinist. In fact, it's almost mandatory the other way around. All it says is you don't believe in God. Now, some people think there shouldn't be a special word for it. I don't believe in the tooth fairy either, or in Santa Claus. I don't have a special word for saying I don't believe that.
But wasn't your...
There doesn't need to be a special ontological category. But Dinesh is right, and we've actually both stated this in different ways. The original arguments, what is the good, what is the bad, what are our duties to each other, is there a point to our existence? The questions of philosophy. Religion is fossilized philosophy, in my view, but it is still philosophy, with most of the questions left out or claimed to be answered, must be asked.
Intercessory prayer, for example, is valid. And if God can be called upon to save, well, let's take the most obvious example, the life of a sick child, and the child recovers, then God has just taken on all the if that happens and is attributable to the intercession, then God has just taken on the responsibility for all the children who don't recover. And the religious get very uneasy when you talk to them like this, because they both do want to say that help is available from on high, but if it's available sometimes, why isn't it available all the time? Why is it so maldistributed? Why is it so random? Why is it so capricious? It only replaces the argument about suffering and evil to where it was in the very first place. Which is why the more intelligent religions are very sparing about claiming divine intervention, because they don't want to arouse too great a demand for it. Now, you may be asking the wrong person when I hear a lot of this stuff, it's white noise to me. If someone dear to me had died, well, this has happened to me, as a matter of fact. If someone comes up to me and says, well, at least they're in a better place now, I don't even remember to be insulted, really. Though I could take offense, I think, at such a fatuous thing being said to me uninvited. But what I can't understand is why I can't put myself in the position of someone who'd be pleased and comforted to hear that. I just can't. I'm really sorry. Nor can I imagine myself saying it to someone who'd suffered a real loss. I can't imagine the expression I'd have to put on my face to say such a thing. So, maybe I'm not the ideal person to put this question to. Or anything of the supernatural, but with religion I say that it's like engaging with philosophy, except philosophy frozen by dogma. Thus, all the original arguments we have are to do with whether or not there's been a supernatural intervention in these questions or not. I also took particular care to say, before you did, that a great number of scientists were subject to one form or another of religious belief. In the case of the greatest one you instance, Sir Isaac Newton, one who thought that your church was the work of the devil,
for example. Your problem, not mine. I don't read Newton for his theological opinions. Newton thought that if you could find the true measurements of the temples in ancient Rimmon and so forth, you'd know more than you could if you'd measured the gravitational field. I don't agree with him. He wouldn't be remembered if that's what he was remembered for. Or he'd be remembered as a crackpot. Same with Alfred Russel Wallace being a spiritualist. However, yes, you're right. I'd give a page of Spinoza for any of those people when it comes, or of David Hume, for any of those people when it comes to reasoning whether or not we are objects of supernatural guidance and divine intervention.
You'd give a page of Spinoza for Plato, Locke, and Kant combined.
I maintain that we are not, and that it's a good thing that we are not, because if we were, we would be living under a celestial dictatorship from which there would be no appeal. That would mean our lives were essentially servile. Now, is that plain?
But if, as you say, it is not to be taken literally, but only at best metaphorically, then you've made the main concession yourself. And my argument would then be, well, is there anything of non-primeval morality that this is the question I asked, that we owe to this, something that without this we wouldn't have? And my conclusion is, my argument is that the answer to that is no. That there are many evil things recommended by this text to which we should close our ears. There are many excellent things to which we should be called, which are either not mentioned or are denied, negated in this text. So it isn't even a good metaphorical beginning.
My friend and ally Daniel Dennett, in his book on belief in belief, says that he thinks it's extremely likely that religious faith gave people advantages of survival. If you go to the witch doctor and you think he is a real doctor, everyone knows that there's an element of morale involved in recovery, and it may be a very small advantage based on an illusion, but these are areas where even a tiny advantage may indeed help. However, rather than confine himself to that, Dinesh goes on to say, but wouldn't it be nice if it was true what the witch doctor said? You just heard him say it. I mean, after all, you'd feel a huge amount better if there was life everlasting as a reward for virtue. Well, that's known as wish thinking. I phrase it like this. I'll take up your Jefferson challenge again, if you like. Thomas Jefferson says in Notes on the State of Virginia about the slavery question, he says, I tremble for my country when I reflect, you've all read it, that God is just. If you haven't read it, you'll remember I said it. You'll go and read it now. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. Who can forget? But if there is a just God, what is there to tremble about? If there's a God who really loves you and knows that you're there and cares for you and looks out for you and is interested in how you're getting on and how you're going to get on and wants the best for you, what is a small question like slavery? All your feelings of responsibility and care about that are dissolved. You're bathed in the refulgence of an absolutely wonderful thing. The only price of it would be, unfortunately, because nothing comes without a price, you'd have to submit to a celestial dictatorship. But hey, what's that in return for a ton of love?
If it was demonstrated to me that Jesus of Nazareth had never existed, all right, that there was no truth to the story at all, my life would go on exactly as it had, and that all the dilemmas that face us would, in my view, be precisely the same as they always are. How do we live the good life? What are our responsibilities to one another? How can we improve on this? How can we build the just city? All of these questions would remain as they will for every generation. To the believer, it would have to be a calamity to discover that this person never existed. They would have to say that their lives were pointless, were meaningless. Now, just think for a second what a confession that constitutes. What an abject confession that is. Well, in that case, I don't care, they'd have to say. Without as St. Paul says, if there was no resurrection, no bodily resurrection, then we are of all people the most miserable. What is it to believe this kind of thing? If I say to a Muslim, you know that the Prophet Muhammad very probably didn't exist anyway, he certainly didn't take dictation from the Archangel Gabriel, don't be silly. The guy acts as if I've said the most unbelievably horrible thing. As if life would be unlivable if what I said was true, or even if I was allowed to say it. What is this? What is this? I ask you. It belongs to the childhood of the race. It belongs to our bawling spoiled infancy. We have to grow up and get over this. Now, why it is that people believe it, I think I can make a guess. I think people are afraid of dying. And I also think that they can be persuaded that an exception can be made in their own case. If they make the relevant propitiations and so on. I'm not of that view. I'm really not. I mean, just try it. Just try standing in the airport or on the street, see them come towards you. Ask first which species of primate they'd be. Okay, is that a chimpanzee there? Is that a silverback gorilla there? Is that an orangutan there? You'll find everyone you know falls into one category or another. It passes the time at airports. And then you say, now look at that one. Now, if that one had gone to church every day and gone to confession every week, and tithed himself and so on, he'd be absolutely assured of eternal life. He'd have nothing to worry about. See if you can make yourself believe it. Then see if you can make yourself believe it about yourself. Well, obviously people can, and there are obviously people who know how to make a living out of this racket. But that's why when I'm told, well, at least you must respect people of faith, I say, well, actually, I don't. I don't think lying to children for a living is a respectable occupation.
The British royal family, I was raised an Anglican, as you may possibly guess. The British royal family has prayers mandated for it to be said. Prayers every single day by every single Anglican in every single service. Prayers for that family, okay? Have you read about the doings of this family lately? The most prayed for family in the world. I would take that as the control experiment if I was you. I'm so glad you asked.
I'm not saying that we've done it yet, but if
Let me take a shot.
If you're saying, what would it take to convince me? Okay, I won't be frivolous. If I thought I saw a
just
miracle,
using the scientific method.
if I thought I saw a dead person walking, for example, I would be much more inclined to think that I was the victim of a hallucination than that I had seen the laws of nature suspended in my favor. That's just the way I am. I think David Hume was right. The laws of nature have just been suspended, apparently in front of your very eyes. Which, nonetheless, is likelier? That they have been suspended, in your favor, almost always, by the way, or that you are under a misapprehension. Always, to me, the first explanation would be the least probable one. The likelihood that I was having a hallucination would have to occur to me.
The
Of course, it wouldn't occur to me if I was undergoing a hallucination, but that's how these ideas get spread around. I invite you to the thought experiment. If it could be shown to you that the figure of the Nazarene was, in fact, as we believe, entirely mythical, as was the figure of his mother, as was the figure of Vishnu, as was the revelation supposedly given to the illiterate Arabian merchant, peasant Muhammad, the man calling himself the prophet, as was the existence of Moses and the legend of the Exodus. If all of this can be shown as it can be, I haven't time for it, but I'll take any challenge on any of these points, to be an entirely man-made legend, would you really look at your neighbor differently? Are you telling me, or are you willing to be told, even by someone as fluent and charming as Dinesh, that it would be true of yourself, that you would then become a thief, that you would then become a liar, that you would then not condemn a rapist, that you would then have no knowledge of the difference between a right action and a wicked one? I don't think there's anyone in this room who could be so abject, so wanting in self-respect, so masochistic, so subject, and I'm coming back to this, so servile, as to believe any such thing. And if I had to stop now, that's all I would really have wanted to say this evening. But as I say, I didn't come to be compassionate. I have some more suffering to inflict on you before I'm done.
The remainder of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, of the Pentateuch, in other words, is largely taken up with exact codification of the different kinds of enslavement of Jewish servants and non-Jewish serfs, the conditions of mass murder and despoilment of other neighboring tribes. There are also incidental and, so to say, by the way, commandments such as the one to stone to death any child that disrespects its parents, and the prohibition on seething a baby goat in its mother's milk, one of those random commandments on which the whole laborious edifice of kosher and kashrut has since been raised. So let's just trace again, to be sure where we are, amid this blizzard of conflicting hysterical orders, the evolutions of the Decalogue. After the commandments specified in Exodus chapter 20 comes Exodus 21, a chapter of so-called judgments, which gives the verdict and sentence in advance for any number of crimes, from smiting to slave rebellion, and from ox goring to witchcraft. And these two have the forces of commandment, and the penalty in all cases is death. Moses then returns from his audience with God to discover his people have lapsed into calf worship and other frivolities. As I mentioned earlier, he thereupon smashes the two tablets, which would surely at that time have been the most precious artifact that could possibly have been known to man, as having been conceived and made wholly by God, smashes them and summons the Levites of his contingent to inflict exemplary punishment. And I quote now from Exodus 32, verses 27 to 28. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, so this too is a divine commandment, by the way. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. So that's a terrific slaughter under orders. And you note the small inconsistency, which may perhaps, I sometimes think, betray the prickings of a poor conscience. In the first verse, the order for the indiscriminate slaughter is from God, thus saith the Lord God of Israel. In the second, it's from Moses. The children of Levi did according to the word of Moses. There's a bit of displacement going on here. We don't know. In either case, it orders the killing of brothers, companions, and in that significant term, as we've seen from the 10th commandment, neighbors, specified. They must die without pity or without discrimination. That's not excessive, perhaps after the infanticide of the firstborn of Egypt. That's already taken place for them to get this far. And it pales beside the anger of Moses in the later book of Numbers, where he speaks to his generals after the battle against the Amalekites and rages at them for sparing so many of the civilians. Now, therefore, he says, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that has known a man by lying with him. But all those women, children that hath not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. In the Age of Reason, Thomas Paine drew attention to this passage, saying that it constituted, I'm quoting Paine, an order to butcher the boys, to massacre the mothers, and to debauch the daughters. A fairly good summary of what I've just read. And this earned him a hurt and high-minded rejoinder from the Bishop of Llandaff, a blithering Welshman who used to try to debate Paine on these questions. He didn't contest the butchery of the boys or the massacre of the mothers, but he did say very plaintively that it wasn't actually stipulated that the daughters were being kept alive for immoral purposes. In other words, the bishop left open the possibility they were being kept as, I suppose, pets.
It is certainly true that I consider that the question of liberty of the mind is involved in the repudiation of theism. Yes, I think that we would be living in a celestial dictatorship if we accepted the authority scripturally revealed of a divine will. And I think this not because, under the inconvenient scrutiny of this eye, I'm not free to rape and pillage and lie as I might wish, because there are other things, I assure you, as I'm sure you will say for yourselves, those of you with any self-respect, that stop me from doing that. But because, and I don't mind admitting this is true, once you grant that there's been a revelation of God to some humans, sometimes, in some places, to be interpreted by a priesthood, then the next thing you will find is that you are being told what to do, what to eat, what you can read, who you can go to bed with, by someone who is no better a mammal or primate than yourself, but who claims to be doing this who claims the right to run your life and your sex life and your mind and your reading matter in the name of God. And I won't have it, okay? And the next thing they'll tell you, the next thing they'll ask you for, the next thing, just be a little thing, is, well, go and live on this piece of someone else's territory. God wants you to settle it. The next thing will be, you're called to holy war now because we can't coexist with the infidel. The next thing will be that. Let it in once and you let it in all of it. Of all the questions of mine that Dinesh didn't even attempt to answer this evening, because we were talking not about Christianity, but about religion, was, is this only true for one sect, or is it true for all of them? If it's only true for one, on what grounds is that the case? If it's true for all of them, where would that leave us as a species? Think on these things, ladies and gentlemen. Think on these things as you go home. Thank you.
And